Slavery in the United States had rather horrid features, and they were taken from various past eras and countries when slavery was the main driving force of the economy. Officially, though, it is believed that the first slaves were brought to the south of the United States, presumably in the first half of the 17th century. Even more so, ships with the slaves became almost analogues of the permanent transport that ran from the coast of Africa to America. Some reports state that already at the beginning of the 19th century, there were at least 4 million slaves in the US. And not only black people, but also people of European origin, which is not considered normal to talk about now. And the only difference between the European slave was its price. On average, it cost 4 times as much. But the African slaves had another undoubted, from the point of view of the slave owners of the South, benefit. According to them, black slaves were more unpretentious, very efficient, and their cost, as you might guess, was not too high-priced. Hence, the masters treated slaves as ordinary property. We have also to add that this attitude was so vile that even in all seriousness it was believed that if a slave fled from his master, then he had some sort of mental illness. The peak. Yet, at the beginning of the 19th century, the situation with the slave trade changed radically. Thanks to the constant work and efforts of the so-called Quakers, which are Christian societies, for example the Society of Friends, and evangelical groups led by William Wilberforce, attitudes toward the transatlantic slave trade began to change. Apart from that, it should be noted here that America was considered at that time a colony of Great Britain. Therefore, it was obliged to comply with the laws that were active in the country of Foggy Albion. And there, thanks to the systematic work of evangelicals and Quakers through the Committee to Ban the Slave Trade, the almost incredible was done. In 1807, the British Parliament passed a law banning the transatlantic slave trade. The same law was supported by United States senators led by President Thomas Jefferson. And since 1808, 1 year after the Britain, the states have imposed a ban on the supply, so to speak, of slaves from Africa and other places. The situation in Deep South. But prohibitions are nonetheless good, but the work there has to be done by a lot of people. Moreover, in the states of the so-called Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, the active cultivation of short fiber cotton began. Considering that at the same time the cotton processing machine was invented, the profitability of cotton production quickly came out on top, displacing both tobacco and other types of crops. Here, almost simultaneously in the states of the so-called Upper South, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Missouri, Indiana, and others, the previously fertile land began to be used up, and it turned out to be a rather unusual situation. On the one hand, more and more slaves were needed to grow and process cotton in the Deep South. At the same time, a surfeit of slaves appeared in the Upper South, which were practically unused. Therefore, the slave owners solved the problem in a rather unique way. From the states of the Upper South, slaves began to be sold to the states of the Deep South. But the paradox of the whole picture was that the adopted law banning the slave trade did not violate this in any way. The fact is that the ban concerned exclusively, the import of slaves, but did not regulate the situation with those slaves who were already within the United States. But if you take out all the slaves from the Upper South, then it's quite logical to expect the moment when the slaves simply run out. There will be no more importation of black African slaves, so the owners of slaves found another way out. Breeding farms. It is generally thought that the idea itself was born in the state of Virginia. Slaves who were not used at work began to be used to reproduce their own kind. In other words, in the states of the Upper South, an inherently inhumane production of labor was established. Thus, soon new terms appeared in the states of Upper South. Breeders, breeding slaves, women in labor, breeding season, and too old to breed. In order for the production of new labor to be effective, slave owners chose very young girls who were obliged to constantly give birth. Young and healthy slaves were used as a tribal force. On average, one slave reproducer accounted for 50 to 200 women and girls. There is unverified information that one of the slaves managed to conceive at least 200 children during the period of his reproduction. This is disgusting, but the production system itself also had rather cynical methods of encouragement. Those who gave birth more received various preferences from the owners. The same applied to men who achieved impressive results in the field of offspring production. Moreover, the slave owners themselves also took part in the conception of offspring. If young girls were pleasant in appearance, then the slave owners took them to satisfy their own specific needs. The children born became slaves who, after reaching the age of just 12 years old, were sold to the states of the Deep South. What is shocking is that the breeders even offered freedom to those women who gave birth to at least 15 children. In reality, if we imagine it purely from a medical point of view, then after 15 births, the woman was no longer of any interest to the master, either as a woman in labor or as the labor force. Method of reproduction. Soon, even a special technique of reproduction was worked out. The requirements were quite severe. A man was required to impregnate at least 12 women in a year, otherwise the young man would be sold to cotton plantations without any pity. Now, this is a very dark page in history, but at the same time, those young slaves who were recognized as incapable of active reproduction were sold not immediately but after castration, which was another condition among the breeders. By technology, it was believed that one fabricator could actively perform his functions for no more than 5 years, after which he was castrated and sent to the slave markets of the Deep South. It is intriguing that for a long time even professional historians categorically denied the very fact of breeding slaves. They adhered to the version that this was just some kind of historical misunderstanding, but in fact horses were bred in the states of the Upper South. As for the slaves, the owners just, so to speak, interfered with the reproduction of slaves in order to maximize profits, as a general practice. Probably such a denial is also due to the fact that an absolutely horrible and creepy practice was used in production. The slave manufacturer could easily impregnate a woman who was related to him as a relative, and so that he could not guess who he was dealing with, both the girl and the man himself put bags on their heads. This practice existed almost everywhere. More so, she brutally broke all ideas about the stability and grace of the family. They were given hoods or bags on their heads, so they wouldn't know who they were doing it to under various threats. It could have been someone they knew. The breeders only wanted the result. In addition, the slaves themselves, in order to forcibly stimulate the birth rate, were almost constantly subjected to special attention, as already mentioned, from the owners, as well as from the male part of the planter's family, and apart from family, overseers and other servants of the slave owner. It was just in the 20th century that there were fairly honest references to how slaves were bred. For one example, the American sociologist Franklin Fraser wrote, "There were masters who, oblivious to the preferences of their slaves, paired their movable property as their cattle. During slavery, there were so-called pastors. They were weighed and checked. A man would hire a cattle breeder and put him in a room with a few young women with whom he wanted to raise children." And now the most entrancing and incredible. In total, the gold reserves of the United States, including bonds and so on, amounted to about $800 million by the first half of the 19th century. At the same time, the value of all slaves was about $4 billion. Slave farming became so lucrative that so-called papers considering slaves became more expensive than gold. Slaves were handed over to banks, they acted as a reliable means of payment, and were considered the most liquid currency. Even today, many people try to deny this economic madness, but the fact indeed remains. Thank you for watching this episode. Subscribe to Flip Side of History and also leave a like. Apart from that, watch our other videos.